Hello YouTube! Today I have another deck tech for you, and this time it's for Modern. And our Modern deck is Blue, Black, Mill. Unlike a lot of mill decks that try to be aggressive and mill with things such as Hedron Grab and Fetch Lands, those are simply outclassed and outraced by burn decks and other aggro decks. So mine is more of control. And I built it to be more well suited to play against a lot of Tier 1 Modern decks, such as Tron and Gifts Ungiven and Millirapod. So things like that this deck does better against, although it may fold to rogue builds or kind of budget versions of those decks that don't run the fetch lands and that don't run a lot of 4-ofs. But let's get started. So first we have, I'll start out with basic lands. We have 7 islands. And 6 swamps. Basic lands are important in blue-black because there's not many ways to answer enchantments like Blood Moon besides counters, so this helps me keep my colored mana. We have 4 Watery Grave. 4 Drowned Catacomb. 3 Sunken Ruins. The only reason I outrun 4 of these is because I don't want to get too many in the early game, because unless I have another land out there, they can only tap for a colorless. Although getting 1 or 2 of them are very good. And then I run a single Nephalia Drownyard. And once again, I don't run many of these because it only makes colorless mana, and that a lot of my early game spells cost both a blue and a black, or rely heavily on one color of mana, so I don't want to get colorless mana in my early game. And now that is a total of 25 lands. And now we have our artifacts, which we just have 4 Howling Mine. And the reason why I run this card is because in addition to helping thin my opponent's deck faster, it also generates card advantage for me, so I can draw answers to what they're drawing. And you'll say, well, they'll get card advantage too. Yes, but my answers generally, I can answer whatever they're playing, and the deck thinning helps. I run 2 Snapcaster Mage. Oh, and the Howling Mine, I sideboard it out if I play any sort of burn deck or very aggressive deck, because in that situation the card advantage for them is too good. The Snapcaster Mages, I only run 2 since I'm winning by mill. I don't really need damage, so the only reason they're in there is simply to give stuff flashback, and it's kind of in the late game, gives me whatever I need. And I only run 2 because in the early game they're 0 help. I run 3 Mana Leak. I only run 3 because once again they're good in the early game, but these, unlike the Snapcaster Mages, are not as good in the late game. And you may notice that I have 1 foil and then this one, and which is a different art than the third, so they're all different from each other in some way. And I do that on purpose to try and show that I have multiples in my deck. Hopefully my opponent will recognize that, and they may think I run a full 4 of them, and they may try to play around counterspells then in situations where I don't even have counterspells. I run 4 Cryptic Command, and this is just an amazing card. Jack of all trades. Counterspells can help me draw to dig for what I need. It can tap down my opponent's army, so they may not be able to attack on a certain turn. Let it come into focus for you guys. Or it can just bounce a permanent back to their hand, so I can, if they're attacking with a Colonnade, I can bounce that back. I can put back their Planeswalkers. It's just great. I run 2 Dimir Charm. I don't know why the focus keeps going out. Sorry, guys. Dimir Charms are really good because of how aggressive Modern is. It can still be a kill spell for most creatures, or countering sorcery spells can come in handy sometimes. And then, if they're starting to get low, I can use that last ability to make sure they don't draw anything good, and the mill for 2 helps a little bit, of course. I mostly use the last ability if they're somehow stacking their deck with something, like if they just pondered, or now pondered isn't even legal in Modern now, is it? I guess the last situation hasn't really come up, and that's why I don't really have a way to explain it. But in case my opponent is stacking their deck in some way, I can use that to put whatever they stacked into their graveyard. I run 4 Damnation. And this, destroy all creatures. I only run 2 creatures in the whole deck, so normally this is a huge gain for me, just wiping all their creatures out of the way to slow them down while I'm milling them out. 4 Surgical Extraction. I do run the full 4, because there's a lot of decks in Modern that like to utilize the graveyard, and then this can just simply exile whatever they're trying to utilize, as well as if they have any in their hand, it helps take cards right out of their hand, so it's almost like a discard spell in some situations. And since it also takes the copy right out of their deck, it can also be like a mill spell, milling 2 or 3 cards at once. This is where I talked about them not having a lot of 4-ofs can hurt me. And also, you may say, Eldrazi's automatically beat this deck. Not true, because if I mill their Emrakul, I can use something like Surgical Extraction to exile the Emrakul in response to the trigger. So they'll get the graveyard shuffled in, but one of the main win conditions of the deck, since most decks that run Emrakul, that's their main win condition, will suddenly be exiled and no longer usable. I run 4 Glimpse of the Unthinkable. This is just the mill card. Mill 10 mana, or 10 cards for just 2 mana. And this is amazing because it's so cheap to mill. Normally it's like a fifth of their deck. A fifth of their deck if I haven't played any mill spells before that. And then with Snapcaster Mage I can do it again for just 4 mana total. So, just an amazing card. I run a single Mind Funeral. I only run 1 because I totally said this is an aggressive mill deck, so I don't need that many mill spells to win. And this is a very, very good mill spell, normally hitting somewhere between 10 and 15 cards for just 3 mana. Oh, and Mind Funeral also becomes better the more things that I surgically extract, because then they have less non-creature or non-land cards in their deck, so it'll tend to hit. It becomes worse, because then it'll tend to hit more lands. So, that's the one downside of Mind Funeral, another reason I only run 1. Archive Trap, I run 4 of, and this is absolutely amazing, because it's for 5, I mill 13, or I can pay 0 if they search their deck this turn. So, think of all the things they search decks with in Modern. They search decks with Gifts Ungiven. They search decks with Expedition Map, with Fetch Lands. They search decks with Birthing Pod. So, Green Sun Zenith isn't legal in Modern, excuse me. But there are just so many things that can search decks that Archive Trap, I can cast it for 0 quite often. And in earlier versions of this deck, I tried Ghost Quarter in it, so then if they decided to get the land off Ghost Quarter, I could Archive Trap them, but I ended up cutting that idea out, just because after I'd do it to opponents once, they'd catch on, and then Ghost Quarter would become like a strip mine, which I guess is still pretty good, but I didn't want all those colorless sources of mana in my deck, when I wouldn't be able to use it to mill them. And then the last cards that I have in here are Haunting Echoes, which I have 3 copies of. And you must be like, what? Haunting Echoes? That's a terrible card. But I think it's actually very good. It exiles all cards in target player's graveyard, so if they're using any deck that utilizes the graveyard, not anymore, and then exiles all cards that have the same name as those cards from their deck. So basically, if I've hit them with like 2 mill spells, and especially if they play a lot of 4-ofs, it rips everything out of their deck. So this just absolutely decimates people. And for this 5 mana, it'll generally win me the game. So that is the main deck. And now we'll move on to the sideboard. So the first card we have on the sideboard is Notion Thief. And Notion Thief is great against things, we only run one of them, is great against decks that use Sphinx's Revelation, or Is It Charm, or just any Thirst for Knowledge. Things like that this is amazing against, because it just lets me draw their cards instead of letting them draw them. So you may say, well, them drawing is mill, but generally they're not drawing to the point where the mill is worth it, and their card advantage just outclasses me, so I'd rather get my own card advantage, letting me draw into my mill spells. And also, if I get something like Is It Charm or Thirst for Knowledge, they still have to do the discard, even though I get the draw, so it just totally stacks my hand and decimates theirs. So this is a great card. The only reason I only ran one of them is because at 4 mana it's kind of expensive, and since I never win by damage, I don't want to load my deck with creatures. Also, control decks are some of my better matchups, so I don't really need much help against them. Next, I run 2 Extirpate, and this is just 2 more copies of Surgical Extraction, basically, for any decks that I need to rip things out of graveyards against. I'll hold it up close if you guys need to read it. Next, I have 4 Spellskite. This card kind of plays double duty, because it's great against both burn and against Bant Hexproof, because if they try to play any enchantments, nope, goes to Spellskite instead. And against any sort of burn or very aggressive red-green decks, none of their burn spells work, because I just redirected to Spellskite, and it's a huge blocker for only 2 mana. Oh, and I should also note, I do also side this in against Splinter Twin, because if they try to play the, they can still combo out with Kiki Jiki, but if they can't cast the enchantment, because then I'll just redirect it to Spellskite. Next is 2 Black Sun Zenith. This comes in against pretty aggressive decks, such as robots, just to help be basically 2 more Damnations. Although I also do put it again against Melirapod variants, because since most of their stuff was Persis, this will stop it from coming back, since it kills with -1/-1 counters. The only problem with that is if they have Melira in play, of course it won't kill their things, but I can normally stop 1 card from entering the battlefield. Next, I have 2 copies of Far and Away, and this is just more spot removal if I need it for the sideboard. The Away really helps against any sort of Bant Hexproof variants, and both sides I can use, like for example, if my opponent has Wormcoil Engine, I can bounce it back to their hand and then exile 1 out of the graveyard to rip it out of their hand, or I can just Away when they attack to get the tokens. That's generally against Tron. Or I can just use both sides to kind of decimate a mid-range deck. And my last sideboard cards are 4 Telemin Performance. And these are strictly for against Tron and Gifts Ungiven. And what it does is it mills until I hit a creature, and then I gain control of that, get that creature. So against Tron, what I can do is generally, if I use this, I'll hit one of their Wormcoil Engines and then just beat their own face with a Wormcoil Engine. Or if I cast a mill spell earlier in the game and I exile all 4 copies of their Wormcoil Engines, I'm assured to hit their Emrakul. And then I either totally mill them out, or I beat their own face with their Emrakul. And well, that's against red-green Tron. Blue Tron is more similar to the Gifts deck, which I'm getting to. And Gifts just plays amazing creatures like Elish Norn and Terastodon and Sphinx of the Steel Wind, and just hitting any of those with Telemin Performance, in addition to milling them for a ton, can just put me in a great position. So, that is my blue-black modern mill. If you have any suggestions for it, I'd love to hear them because I'm planning to go to some big events with this deck and see how it does. So hopefully we can discuss it and make it better. So please leave your feedback in the comments. Give me a like rating if you liked it. And I guess I will see you guys when I do my next deck tech. See ya.